have with us today Mary Durran, who is our program officer for Latin America. And she began her career in El Salvador as the coordinator for the London-based Central America Human Rights Committee, and then was a freelance journalist in the early 90s based in El Salvador and covering Central America. We also have a guest with us, Mike Flynn. Mike Flynn worked for Development and Peace right from the earliest days of Development and Peace, and served in a number of different staff roles, including director. And Mike is retired now, but was working at Development and Peace during Romero's time. So without further ado, we will go into the panel. And just going to begin by inviting Mike to speak first. And Mike, could you start us off by taking us back to that time in 1980? How was Development and Peace involved with what was happening in Latin America broadly and El Salvador specifically? And can you share your reflections with us today on what it means for us today and as well in the context of the time?
I was around for a long, long time. I started out as a projects officer in Africa and Asia, I'm not the person that is the most expert on Latin America, but I was there at the point of when we were involved with Archbishop Romero and at the time of his death. Our main link to the diocese and to Archbishop Romero was the Office of Legal Assistance. The Office of Legal Assistance was an organization that existed to defend the rights, human rights, peasant rights, land title, whatever, of the peasants in Salvador. And it was challenging the parameters of a society that operated almost solely in the interests of the wealthy, which was kind of the phenomenon at that point in Central America. I don't know if it's changed all that much since, but that was the environment in which we worked. And we worked on a number of levels, as Development and Peace always does. We're part of a collection of groups that were trying to apply international pressure on the regime in collaboration with other church organizations, secular organizations, trying to move the regime more to the center and to some sense of humanity. We were involved in a campaign at that time to stop the flow of military aid to the Salvadorian regime, something which happened about a year after Romero's death, when the 3 American sisters and a lay worker were raped and murdered by a Salvadorian death squad. And that it took that before the Americans would move. And clearly by providing financial support to the Archdiocesan Office of Legal Assistance, but also to other projects and programs in Salvador. And that had us in frequent contact with the Archbishop, particularly the legal aid, and there was, I guess, a new renewal coming up, and the Development and Peace Projects officer at the time, and for the life of me, can't remember who it was in touch with Romero a couple of days before he died. So that's kind of the nature of the relationship that we had. I think when we're coming together to reflect on Romero and his significance, and it's important also to look at kind of where he came from. He came from modest roots, but he kind of was a pretty conservative character starting out, particularly when he was an auxiliary bishop in San Salvador. He was seen essentially as a servant of the institution. In fact, when they were making him archbishop later on, the priests in the archdiocese kind of complained because they really didn't want him. But in the meantime, he'd been shifted off to a smaller diocese as bishop, and there he got involved with the people, engaged on their behalf and working along with the peasants who were struggling to eke out an existence in a land of oligarchs and big landowners, and a great deal of violence being directed to those people. And that, I think, brought the Archbishop kind of back to his modest roots where he started out. And so for him, the whole thing was kind of a journey of starting out in a family that wasn't well off, getting into the mainstream in a sense, and getting towards the elite, and then gaining or learning through the people. So anyway, for the Archbishop, the preferential option for the poor was, I think, it wasn't a theological principle or something that was read in a book. was something he incorporated himself, and he came to incorporate it as a principle. And oftentimes, people wonder why was this guy assassinated? Was it that Romero was an emissary of the Vatican, putting pressure on the regime to clean up its human rights record? In fact, no. The position of the Vatican at that time was kind of more in line with the regime than it was with the people. The church at that time had some elements of the church had a great fear of liberation theology, of grace Christian communities, and of a church aligned with the poor. Was it that he was a representative of the Salvatorian bishops and they were pushing? No, not really. People talked about Romero, the man of peace. And while it's true that he was a man of peace, and he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in '97, he was somebody who really was a person of conviction and an advocate for justice rather than simply someone who was kind of in favor of peace as a principle. Because he challenged the order of things and was prepared to die to see things happen. And in the end, he died. He evolved. There was no kind of revolutionary thing that happened there. He evolved into becoming an advocate of the poor and for their rights, precisely because of his faith, not in spite of it. There's some lessons, I guess, we can take from that, from what Romero's life, that he grew through his engagement with the people, and I think that's been a principle that's been a solid principle of development and peace from the beginning. And he was involved and engaged in a way that forced him to make choices and to take sides. He was involved in a way that got beyond the notion of being charitable or to the people, but to be involved in the work of justice. Charity is a kind of an individual virtue where one can be generous, one can help someone in need. Justice is a collective virtue. You really can't be just in a real sense all on your own. Justice takes people working together. It takes people who are prepared to collaborate, who are prepared to look at the causes of things, who are prepared to get engaged in a process of change. And change is never black and white. It's an evolving process of overcoming and facing practical limitations, and often making difficult choices, sometimes when they're not all good choices. But to see one's own assumptions and predispositions challenged and be prepared to see that happen and be prepared to actually change because of the encounter with people. A commitment to defending the dignity of people, their rights, and to lend solidarity and support those people in the choices they've made. So all of that, I think, are things that one can draw from the experience of the life of Oscar Romero.
Thanks very much for your observations and your thoughts and reflections. And we'll now invite Mary Durran, our program officer, to offer her reflections.
Okay, well, there are two quotations that come to mind when I think of the influence of Oscar Romero on the work of our partners in Latin America today. The first one is, "It is not the will of God that some people have everything and others have nothing." And as has been mentioned, in El Salvador in the 1970s, Archbishop Romero was a pioneer in applying the pastoral cycle of see, judge, and act, which is a principle that we apply to our work in development and peace. Now, his observation that the wealth of El Salvador, the tiniest country of Central America, was in the hands of a wealthy minority, that's the famous 14 elite families who ran the country. He saw then the poverty of the landless peasants. He saw the disdain with which the rich treated them. He saw the poor living in infrahuman conditions on the coffee plantations of the rich. And he started to speak about his observations and to reflect on them in his homilies that were broadcast every week live on the radio. And he quickly came to the conclusion that the church couldn't stay indifferent to this situation. And he said then, "A church that doesn't spark crises, a gospel that doesn't disturb, a word of God that doesn't address the real sin of the society in which it's proclaimed, which gospel are we talking about?" So, of course, these calls on the church to get involved, react to the structural sin ingrained in the Salvadorian society, and to speak out for the rights of the poor angered some sectors of the church, which was traditionally an ally of the Salvadorian elite minority. Later on, in the face of increasing military repression of peasants who were organizing to demand land reform, the right to food, healthcare, education, and generally the right to live in dignity as human beings should, on the eve of his assassination, Romero ordered the military to disobey unjust orders. And after seeing and judging, then comes action. And he said then, "I make a call to the men of the army and the National Guard, the police and to the barracks. My brothers, we are all the same people. You are killing your own peasant brothers. When you receive an order to kill a man, you should consider the law of God that says you shall not kill. In the name of God and in the name of the suffering people, I beg you, I order you, stop the repression." And the day after he was assassinated. This cycle of see, judge, act that was put into practice by Romero and then was further developed by the Christian communities of El Salvador, it's at the base of our work in Latin America today. So in the years following the assassination of Oscar Romero, Christian communities took his words to heart, acting to demand justice and structural change. Some took up arms with the FMLN guerrillas as a result of their Christian commitment to working for justice. And there were some priests who traveled around constantly with the guerrillas, ministering to their spiritual needs. However, many more Salvadorans chose to work peacefully for economic justice and eventually a just peace. And this was the sector that Development and Peace worked with when we had a program in El Salvador. We worked with the base Christian communities movement. We worked with women, many of whose husbands and sons had been killed or disappeared or tortured by the army. We also worked with the movement of internally displaced people, and there were thousands and thousands of Salvadorians who had to abandon their villages because of the war. And we worked also with the refugees who left El Salvador to settle in neighboring countries and who returned towards the end of the war to rebuild the country in repatriated villages. So this dynamic of see, judge, act is very present in our work in Latin America today. We fund several partners currently who cover news from a social justice perspective, countering the narrative of commercial media, often are allied to local elites. These groups include a network of community radios, ALER, and ALAI, the Latin American news agency. Our program is also strong on analysis. We have several partners who carry out research and social analysis, such as the Fundación ERIC in Honduras and Alforja in Costa Rica are a couple of examples. We're also strong on leadership training. We have at least 2 leadership training schools, one run by the Instituto Bartolomé de las Casas in Peru, and the other run by the Fundación ERIC in Honduras. Part of the training in these schools is analysis of news put out by the corporate media, a reinterpretation and exercise of truth-telling, then reflection and follow-up action in the communities the leaders return to. So the Romero anniversary this week was also highlighted by many of our partners in Latin America. In Costa Rica, a partner, the DEI, the Ecumenical Research Department, stated, "We learn from Oscar Romero the radical nature of the option for the poor, an option that challenges us to always put ourselves in the place of the poorest of the poor." And Gustavo Gutierrez, founder of our partner Instituto Bartolomé de las Casas in Peru, reflected this week on the important anniversary, calling Romero an exceptional witness to many of the difficult situations we've lived through in Latin America of announcing the Gospels, and a symbol of the Latin American experience of martyrdom, because so many people have been killed for their commitment to the poorest of the poor. So finally, I'd like to end with a particularly relevant message today from Honduras, neighbor to El Salvador, and where our partners hold Romero in particular esteem. And this is a reflection from Father Ismael Moreno, known as Padre Melo, on the message of Romero and its relevance for the particular situation we find ourselves in today.
En estos tiempos de incertidumbres, en estos tiempos de agobio, incluso de miedo ante el próximo futuro, nosotros les damos nuestro saludo y nuestro abrazo desde Honduras. Y además lo hacemos en memoria y en presencia de Monseñor Romero, en sus 40 años de caminar con nosotros. En estos tiempos tan difíciles, volvemos nuestra mirada, volvemos nuestro corazón hacia Monseñor Romero. ¿Y qué nos dice Monseñor Romero? No desmayemos. Las situaciones pueden ser muy difíciles, pueden ser muy oscuras, pero el Dios de la vida, el Dios de los amaneceres, el Dios que es el constructor perpetuo de las alegrías de los pobres, nos está diciendo que los caminos siempre pueden ser nuevos. Eso es lo que nos dice Monseñor Romero. Y aunque estemos abatidos y preocupados, no es el miedo, no es la desgracia, no es la dictadura, no son las armas, no es la muerte lo que nos van a decir las últimas palabras, sino las últimas palabras ya nos las dijo Monseñor Romero. Vamos para adelante, el futuro es nuestro. Y no es la represión la que va a construir nuevos caminos, sino el renacer incesante, sino la hermandad. No busquemos, hermanas y hermanos, respuestas desde arriba. No busquemos respuestas verticales. Construyamos respuestas entre hermanos y hermanas, es decir, respuestas horizontales, para que de esa manera nos descubramos que un nuevo amanecer está con nosotros. Y en ese sentido nosotros hoy podemos decir, Monseñor Romero, el santo de nuestro pueblo, hoy celebramos 40 años de incesante renacer.
We started this online celebration with the words of Romero, and we will end it with the words of Romero. And Mary shared a passage from the sermon that he preached the day before he was murdered. And it just so happens that that sermon actually took place on the 5th Sunday of Lent, which for us at Development of Peace is also a Solidarity Sunday. I'm going to play that passage, and you will hear the end of his sermon and the applause that comes after it. And I'll put the words up in English, and that will serve as our closing prayer.
Matan a sus mismos hermanos campesinos, y ante una orden de matar que dé un hombre, debe de prevalecer la ley de Dios que dice no matar. Ningún soldado está obligado a obedecer una orden contra la ley de Dios. Una ley inmoral, nadie tiene que cumplirla. Ya es tiempo de que recuperen su conciencia y que obedezcan antes a su conciencia que a la orden del pecado. La Iglesia, defensora de los derechos de Dios, de la ley de Dios, de la dignidad humana, de la persona, no puede quedarse callada ante tanta abominación. Queremos que el gobierno tome en serio que de nada sirven las reformas si van teñidas con tanta sangre. En nombre de Dios, pues, y en nombre de este sufrido pueblo, cuyos lamentos suben hasta el cielo cada día más tumultuosos, les suplico, les ruego les ordeno en nombre de Dios, cese la represión,